Picture this. It's 1943, the middle of World War II, and you're a prisoner of war stuck in a camp in British East Africa, thousands of miles from home. The war rages on across Europe. Your country is crumbling, and you're trapped behind barbed wire in the scorching heat of equatorial Africa. Most prisoners would resign themselves to their fate, counting down the days until the war ends. But not these three Italian soldiers. No, they had a different plan entirely. They were going to climb Mount Kenya, one of Africa's most dangerous mountains, just to prove they could. This is the story of the most audacious, bizarre, and utterly fascinating escape attempt in military history. Before we dive deep into this incredible tale, let me set the stage for you. The year is 1943, and World War II is at its height. Italy, once part of the Axis powers alongside Germany and Japan, is beginning to crumble under the weight of Allied advances. Thousands of Italian soldiers have been captured across North Africa and the Mediterranean, and many of them end up in prisoner of war camps scattered throughout the British Empire. One such camp is located in Nanyuki, a small town in British East Africa, now known as Kenya. The camp itself isn't particularly harsh by wartime standards. The guards are relatively relaxed, the food is adequate, and the climate, while hot, is bearable. But for soldiers used to the mountains of Italy, the flat, dusty landscape of the Kenyan highlands must have felt like a prison in itself. Among the thousands of Italian POWs held in this camp are three men who would become legends. Felice Benuzzi, a mountaineer and civil servant from Trieste. Giovanni Belletto, known as Juan, a skilled climber and adventurer. And Vincenzo Barsati, Enzo for short, a tough, resourceful soldier with a knack for getting things done. These three men shared something that set them apart from their fellow prisoners. They weren't just soldiers marking time until the war ended. They were dreamers, adventurers, men who couldn't stand the idea of wasting away in captivity. And every single day, they could see Mount Kenya rising up in the distance, its snow-capped peaks gleaming in the African sun, calling to them like a siren song. Now, let's talk about Mount Kenya itself, because understanding this mountain is crucial to understanding just how insane this escape attempt really was. Mount Kenya is the second highest mountain in Africa, standing at over 17,000 feet. It's a stratovolcano formed millions of years ago, with jagged peaks covered in glaciers and ice fields. The mountain is notorious for its unpredictable weather, treacherous terrain, and the effects of high altitude. Even today, with modern equipment and experienced guides, climbing Mount Kenya is no joke. People die on this mountain. They get lost, they fall, they succumb to altitude sickness. And these three Italian POWs want to climb it with homemade equipment, no maps, and absolutely no permission. So why would anyone attempt something so dangerous, so seemingly pointless? Well, for Benuzzi and his companions, it wasn't pointless at all. It was about freedom, not in the literal sense of escaping the war, but freedom of the spirit. Benuzzi himself would later write about this in his book, No Picnic on Mount Kenya, which chronicles the entire adventure. He described the crushing monotony of camp life, the way the days blurred together into an endless gray sameness. He wrote about how the sight of Mount Kenya became an obsession, a challenge that demanded to be answered. For these men, climbing the mountain wasn't about getting away. It was about proving to themselves that they were still alive, still capable, still free in the ways that truly mattered. The planning began in secret, of course. You couldn't just walk up to the British guards and ask for climbing equipment. Everything had to be improvised, scavenged, or stolen. Benuzzi, Belletto, and Barsati spent months preparing for their attempt. They studied the mountain from a distance, tried to plot a route using nothing but their own observations and a few smuggled maps. They crafted makeshift climbing gear from whatever they could find in the camp. Ropes were braided from sisal fibers. Ice axes were fashioned from scrap metal. Crampons, those essential spiked boots needed for climbing ice, were hammered together from tin cans and wire. They even made a crude tent from stolen blankets and sacks. Every item had to be hidden from the guards and from their fellow prisoners, who might accidentally give them away. Food was another major concern. The rations in the POW camp were sufficient for survival, but barely enough for the kind of physical exertion required to climb a mountain. The three men began hoarding whatever extra food they could get their hands on. Biscuits, dried meat, sugar, anything that would keep and provide energy. They calculated that they would need enough supplies for at least a week, maybe more if things went wrong. And things, as you might imagine, were very likely to go wrong. But that didn't deter them. If anything, the danger made the whole endeavor more appealing. These were men who craved adventure, who needed to feel alive again after months of mind-numbing captivity. Finally, after months of preparation, the day arrived. It was January 1943. WWII, Baleto, and Barsati waited until nightfall and then simply walked out of the camp. Yes, you heard that right. They walked out. The security at the Nanyuki POW camp was surprisingly lax. The British didn't consider the Italians to be a serious escape risk. After all, where would they go? They were in the middle of Africa, surrounded by hostile terrain, wild animals, and British forces. Any rational person attempting to escape would try to make for the coast or find a way back to Italian-controlled territory. The idea that someone would escape just to climb a mountain was so absurd that it never even occurred to the guards. Under the cover of darkness, the three Italians slipped through the perimeter and began their trek toward Mount Kenya. They carried their homemade equipment, their meager supplies, and an almost reckless confidence that they could pull this off. The first part of the journey was relatively straightforward. They hiked through the foothills, navigating by the stars and the looming silhouette of the mountain. The nights were cold, the days were hot, and every step brought them closer to their goal. But it also brought them closer to danger. They were traveling through lion and leopard country, and they had no weapons. They were also acutely aware that if they were caught, they would face serious punishment. Escaping from a POW camp was a court-martial offense. But none of that mattered. The mountain was calling, and they were going to answer. As they climbed higher, the terrain became more challenging. The lush foothills gave way to dense bamboo forests, which in turn gave way to moorlands covered in strange, otherworldly plants. Giant lobelias and groundsels towered over them, relics of a primordial age. The air grew thinner, and every breath became a little harder. They were entering the realm of high altitude, where the human body begins to struggle. Altitude sickness is a real and serious danger on mountains like Kenya. It can cause headaches, nausea, confusion, and in severe cases, death. The three Italians had no way of knowing if they would climb it properly. They just had to push forward and hope for the best. Their equipment, cobbled together from scraps, began to show its limitations. The ropes frayed, the crampons bent, and sometimes broke. The tent, such as it was, barely kept out the cold and the wind. But they pressed on. WWII, the de facto leader of the group, kept meticulous notes of their progress. He recorded the plants they saw, the animals they encountered, the conditions they faced. His observations would later form the basis of his book, a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. But at the time, he was just trying to survive and to reach the summit. After several days of hard climbing, they reached the lower glaciers of Mount Kenya. This was a whole new level of difficulty. Glacier climbing requires skill, experience, and proper equipment. They had none of these things. Their homemade crampons were barely adequate, and their ice axes, fashioned from scrap metal, were crude at best. But they had determination, and they had each other. They roped themselves together and began the slow, agonizing ascent across the ice. One wrong step could send them all plummeting into a crevasse. The cold was brutal, the wind was relentless, and the altitude was taking its toll. But they kept going. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. They didn't actually make it to the highest peak of Mount Kenya. The summit, called Batian, is a technical climb that requires serious mountaineering expertise. Even with their incredible determination, the three Italians simply didn't have the skills or the equipment to reach it. But they did make it to Point Lenana, the third highest peak on the mountain, which stands at just over 16,000 feet. For them, this was enough. They had climbed Mount Kenya. They had done what they set out to do. Standing on that peak, looking out over the vast expanse of Africa below them, they felt a sense of freedom and accomplishment that no prison could take away. But their adventure wasn't over yet. They still had to get back down, and then they had to return to the camp. Yes, return to the camp. Because as I mentioned earlier, this wasn't really an escape in the traditional sense. They had no intention of trying to flee to freedom. They knew that was impossible. They were thousands of miles from Italy in the middle of enemy territory, with no resources and no support. What they wanted was the climb, the challenge, the proof that they were still men, not just numbers in a prison camp. And so, after spending a few precious moments on the summit, they began their descent. The journey back down was, if anything, even more dangerous than the climb up. Exhausted, hungry, and suffering from the effects of altitude, they had to navigate the same treacherous terrain they had struggled up. The descent through the glaciers was nerve-wracking. Every step had to be carefully placed, every handhold tested. One of them slipped at one point and was only saved by the rope that tied him to his companions. It was a stark reminder of just how close they were to disaster at every moment. But they made it down the ice, down through the moorlands, back through the bamboo forests, and finally to the foothills. When they were close to the camp, they did something that might seem insane, but was actually quite logical under the circumstances. They turned themselves in. They walked up to the perimeter of the camp and surrendered to the guards. The British were absolutely baffled. 3 prisoners had gone missing for over a week, and here they were, voluntarily coming back. Where had they been? What had they been doing? When Benuzzi explained that they had climbed Mount Kenya, the guards didn't believe him at first. It was too absurd, but the evidence was right there in front of them. The 3 men were sunburned, frostbitten, and exhausted. Their clothes were torn and filthy. Their homemade equipment, what was left of it, told the story of an incredible journey. The British didn't quite know what to make of this situation. Technically, the 3 Italians had escaped from a POW camp, which was a serious offense. But they had also voluntarily returned, which was unusual to say the least. And their stated reason for escaping, to climb a mountain, was so bizarre that it almost defied punishment. In the end, the 3 men were sentenced to a relatively light punishment. They spent a few weeks in solitary confinement and lost some privileges, but that was about it. The British guards, many of whom were mountaineers themselves, seemed to have a grudging respect for what the Italians had accomplished. Some of them even congratulated Benuzzi and his companions on their climb. News of the climb spread through the POW camp and beyond. The other Italian prisoners were amazed and inspired by what their comrades had done. Here was proof that the human spirit couldn't be caged, that even in the darkest circumstances, there was room for adventure and achievement. The story reached Italian and British commanders, and eventually, it made its way into the pages of history. Benuzzi's book, published after the war, brought the tale to a wider audience and cemented the climb as one of the most unusual episodes of World War II. But let's take a step back and think about what this story really means. On the surface, it's a tale of adventure, of 3 men doing something incredibly daring and dangerous just for the sake of doing it. But it's also a story about freedom, about what it means to be truly free. Benuzzi and his companions were prisoners of war. They had no physical freedom. They couldn't go where they wanted, do what they wanted, or live their lives as they chose. But they found a different kind of freedom, one that no prison camp could take away. They found a freedom to choose their own challenges, to set their own goals, to prove to themselves that they were more than just captives. In a way, their climb of Mount Kenya was an act of defiance, not against the British, but against the very idea that they could be reduced to mere prisoners. This story also raises interesting questions about the nature of escape. What does it mean to escape? Most people would say it means getting away, breaking free, fleeing to safety. But Benuzzi, Belletto, and Barsati showed that escape can mean something different. They escaped the mental prison of boredom and despair. They escaped the feeling of helplessness that comes with being a POW. They didn't escape the physical camp, at least not permanently, but in a sense, they achieved something more valuable. They escaped the limitations that their circumstances tried to impose on them. Now, It's worth noting that this kind of story is only possible because of the relatively humane conditions in the Nanyuki POW camp. The British, to their credit, treated their Italian prisoners reasonably well. There was no torture, no starvation, no deliberate cruelty. If Benuzzi and his companions had been in a German or Japanese POW camp, this story would have ended very differently. The fact that they could even conceive of such a plan, let alone carry it out, speaks to the relatively relaxed atmosphere of the camp. And the fact that they were punished so lightly upon their return shows a level of understanding and even admiration from their captors. It's a reminder that even in war, there can be moments of humanity and decency. Let's also consider the technical achievement of what they did. Climbing Mount Kenya is difficult even with modern equipment. These men did it with gear they made themselves from scraps. They had no proper maps, no guides, no support team waiting at base camp. They were operating on instinct, determination, and a basic understanding of mountaineering principles. The fact that they made it as far as they did, let alone to one of the peaks, is a testament to their skill and resourcefulness. Mountaineering experts have looked at this story and marveled at what they accomplished. Some have tried to replicate the climb using similar homemade equipment and found it incredibly challenging. It's a reminder of just how capable humans can be when they're properly motivated. The story of the Mount Kenya escape also fits into a larger pattern of prisoner of war escapes during World War II. The war saw dozens of famous escape attempts, from the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III to the Wooden Horse Escape. These stories have been romanticized in books and films, often focusing on the cleverness and bravery of the escapees. But what makes the Mount Kenya climb unique is its motivation. Most POW escapes were attempts to return to the fight, to get back to friendly territory and rejoin the war effort. The Italian climb had no such practical goal. It was pure adventure, pure challenge. In that sense, it stands alone as the most unusual escape attempt of the war. Benuzzi's book, No Picnic on Mount Kenya, was published in several languages after the war and became something of a classic in mountaineering literature. It's not just a tale of adventure, though it certainly is that. It's also a meditation on freedom, captivity, and the human need for challenge. Benuzzi writes beautifully about the landscape of Kenya, the strange plants and animals they encountered, the beauty and terror of the mountain. He also writes honestly about the fear they felt, the doubts that crept in, the moments when they wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. It's a deeply human book, one that resonates with anyone who has ever felt trapped and longed for something more. The three men went on to lead interesting lives after the war. Benuzzi returned to Italy and continued his career as a civil servant, eventually becoming the Italian ambassador to several African countries. It's ironic, in a way, that he ended up back in Africa, the continent where he had his greatest adventure. Belletto and Barsati also returned to Italy and resumed their lives. They remained friends with Benuzzi and occasionally recounted their incredible climb to anyone who would listen. All three men lived long lives, and to the end of their days, they considered the climb of Mount Kenya to be one of the defining experiences of their lives. There's also a broader historical context to consider here. World War II was a global conflict that touched every continent and involved millions of people. We tend to focus on the major battles, the famous generals, the turning points that decided the outcome of the war. But history is also made up of countless smaller stories, individual acts of courage, foolishness, and humanity. The Mount Kenya climb is one of those stories. It didn't change the course of the war. It didn't save lives or win battles. But it matters because it shows us something important about the human spirit. It shows us that even in the darkest times, people can find ways to assert their dignity and their freedom. The Italian prisoners of war in East Africa were, in many ways, forgotten men. Their country had been defeated, their cause was lost, and they were stuck in a remote corner of the world waiting for the war to end. It would have been easy for them to sink into despair, to give up hope. But men like Benuzzi, Belletto, and Barsati refused to accept that fate. They found meaning and purpose in the most unlikely of places, on the slopes of a dangerous mountain. And in doing so, they reminded us all that the human spirit is capable of incredible things. Let's talk about the practical challenges they faced in a bit more detail, because the more you learn about this climb, the more impressive it becomes. First, there's the issue of navigation. Mount Kenya is a complex mountain with multiple peaks, glaciers, and treacherous terrain. Even experienced mountaineers with detail maps can get lost. Banuzi and his companions had no real maps. They relied on observations they made from the POW camp, which was miles away, and on their own instincts once they were on the mountain. The fact that they didn't get hopelessly lost is remarkable in itself. Then there's the equipment. Modern mountaineers use specialized gear designed specifically for high-altitude climbing. They have insulated clothing, high-tech tents, advanced rope systems, crampons made from hardened steel, ice axes designed for maximum efficiency. Banuzi and his friends had none of this. Their crampons were made from tin cans and wire. Their ice axes were hammered together from scrap metal. Their tent was stitched together from old blankets. And yet, this cobbled-together equipment was good enough to get them up the mountain. It speaks to their ingenuity and their determination. They made do with what they had and refused to let the lack of proper gear stop them. Food and water were also major concerns. At high altitude, the human body needs more calories and more water than usual. The thin air makes everything harder, from breathing to digesting food. The three Italians had hoarded what they could from the camp, but it wasn't much. They were essentially operating on starvation rations for much of the climb. They had to ration everything carefully, knowing that running out of food could mean the difference between success and failure, or even life and death. And they couldn't hunt or forage much because they were above the tree line for much of the climb in a barren, frozen landscape where almost nothing edible grew. Then there's the weather. Mount Kenya is located right on the equator, which might make you think it's always warm. But at high altitude, the temperature drops dramatically. The glaciers and snow fields at the top of the mountain are bitterly cold, especially at night. Banuzi and his companions had no proper cold weather gear. They layered whatever clothing they could find, but it was never enough. They spent nights huddled together in their flimsy tent, shivering and trying to stay warm. Frostbite was a constant danger, and all three men suffered from it to some degree. The fact that they didn't lose fingers or toes is something of a miracle. Wildlife was another potential hazard, though less so than you might think. In the lower elevations, they were in lion and leopard territory. These are apex predators, and an unarmed human is easy prey. But the three men were lucky. They encountered no large predators on their journey. At higher elevations, the main animal concern was buffalo, which are notoriously bad-tempered and dangerous. But again, they had no serious encounters. It's possible that their scent or the noise they made kept the animals at bay. Or maybe they were just lucky. Either way, they made it through without being mauled or trampled, which is no small feat. One of the most fascinating aspects of this story is the psychological dimension. What drives someone to do something like this? Most people, when faced with the monotony and hardship of a POW camp, would try to cope by shutting down, by making themselves as small and unobtrusive as possible, just trying to survive until the war ends. But Banuzi and his companions did the opposite. They set themselves an enormous, seemingly impossible challenge. They deliberately sought out danger and hardship. Why? The answer, I think, lies in the human need for meaning and purpose. Without a challenge, without something to strive for, life becomes unbearable. The climb gave them a goal, a reason to wake up in the morning, a sense of purpose that the camp couldn't provide. It was, in a very real sense, what kept them sane. There's also an element of rebellion in their act. They were prisoners, yes, but they refused to act like prisoners. They refused to let their captivity define them. By escaping, even temporarily, even just to climb a mountain, they were asserting their independence. They were saying, in effect, you can lock us up, but you can't control our spirits. You can't take away our dreams. It's a powerful message, one that resonates far beyond the specifics of their situation. Anyone who has ever felt trapped, whether by circumstances, by society, or by their own fears, can relate to that desire to break free and do something extraordinary. The British response to the climb is also worth examining. The guards could have been furious. They could have seen this as a serious breach of security and punished the three men harshly. But instead, they showed a surprising amount of leniency. Part of this was probably practical. The three Italians had returned voluntarily, so they clearly weren't trying to rejoin the war. They posed no real threat. But I think there was also an element of respect. Many of the British guards were themselves outdoorsmen and adventurers. They understood the pull of a mountain, the desire to test oneself against nature. In a way, they saw kindred spirits in Benuzzi, Balletto, and Barsati. And so, they went easy on them. It's a reminder that even in war, there can be moments of mutual respect and understanding between enemies. After the war, the story of the Mount Kenya climb became a symbol of Italian resilience and spirit. Italy had been on the losing side of the war, and the post-war years were difficult for the country. But stories like this of ordinary men doing extraordinary things helped to rebuild national pride. Benuzzi became something of a celebrity, and his book was widely read. It showed Italians that even in defeat, even in the darkest times, they were capable of greatness. It's a message that every nation, every person needs to hear from time to time. The climb also had an impact on the world of mountaineering. Point Lenana, the peak they reached, is now a popular destination for climbers visiting Mount Kenya. Many of them know the story of the three Italian POWs and feel inspired by it. There's even a plaque on the mountain commemorating their achievement. It's a small thing, but it ensures that their story won't be forgotten. It reminds future generations that mountains are more than just physical challenges. They're tests of character, opportunities to prove what we're capable of when we push ourselves to the limit. In recent years, the story has been rediscovered by new audiences. There have been documentaries, articles, and even proposals for a film adaptation. Each new generation finds something different in the story. For some, it's a tale of adventure and daring. For others, it's a meditation on freedom and captivity. For still others, it's a reminder of the absurdity and tragedy of war. All of these interpretations are valid because it's a rich, complex story that operates on multiple levels. It's not just about three guys climbing a mountain. It's about the human condition, about what we do when faced with impossible circumstances, about how we find meaning in a meaningless world. Let me bring this full circle and talk about why this story matters today. We live in a world that's very different from the one Benuzzi and his companions inhabited. World War II is now firmly in the past, a subject for history books and documentaries. POW camps, at least of the kind they experienced, are largely a thing of the past. But the fundamental questions their story raises are still relevant. What does it mean to be free? How do we find meaning and purpose in our lives? What are we willing to risk for a dream? These are timeless questions, and the story of the Mount Kenya climb offers some compelling answers. In a way, we're all prisoners of one kind or another. We're trapped by our jobs, our responsibilities, our fears, our limitations. And like Benuzzi and his companions, we have a choice. We can accept our prisons and resign ourselves to them, or we can look for ways to break free, even if only temporarily, even if only in spirit. We can set ourselves challenges, pursue our dreams, test our limits. The mountain is always there, calling to us, waiting to be climbed. The only question is whether we have the courage to answer. So what can we learn from these three Italian soldiers who escaped from a POW camp just to climb a mountain? We can learn that freedom is more than just physical liberty. We can learn that the human spirit is capable of incredible things when properly motivated. We can learn that even in the darkest times, there's room for adventure, for beauty, for joy. We can learn that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that don't have a practical destination, that the climb itself is the reward. And we can learn that no matter how trapped we might feel, there's always a mountain waiting for us if we're brave enough to seek it out. The story of Felice Benuzzi, Giovanni Balletto, and Vincenzo Barsati is one of the most remarkable and unusual tales to come out of World War II. It's a story that deserves to be remembered and retold, not just because it's an incredible adventure, but because it teaches us something profound about what it means to be human. These three men, in the middle of a brutal global conflict, chose to do something utterly impractical and utterly necessary. They chose to climb a mountain. And in doing so, they proved that the human spirit cannot be caged, that dreams cannot be locked away, and that freedom is something we carry within us, no matter where we are or what circumstances we face. As we close this story, I want you to think about your own mountains. What challenges are calling to you? What dreams have you put aside because they seem impractical or impossible? What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? The three Italians who climbed Mount Kenya didn't know if they would succeed. They didn't know if they would survive. But they tried anyway, because the alternative, living without purpose, without challenge, without that spark of adventure, was worse than any danger they might face on the mountain. That's the real lesson of this story. That's the gift they left us. The reminder that we all have the power to choose our own challenges, to set our own goals, to climb our own mountains, whatever form they might take.